It's Friday Eve. Welcome into First Take. Thank you so much for spending part of your day here with us. Molly, Karam in Bristol. Your boys are in New Orleans with all that good food ahead of Sunday's NBA All-Star Game. Hi, guys.
What's up? What's up?
Molly.
Good morning. How y'all doing?
Good. A lot to get into.
Today?
And you both know where we're starting, right? Let's do it. After last week's Charles Oakley's controversy, the Warriors' Draymond Green had some strong comments about Knicks owner James Dolan. This was Green on his Dre Day podcast.
This is Charles Oakley. Why is he buying tickets to the game? If I'm not mistaken, Dolan's was owning that team when he was playing. It wasn't a problem when he was speaking out then. It wasn't a problem when he was protecting their superstars then. And so if it wasn't a problem then when he were doing it for y'all, why is it all of a sudden a problem now when he speak out on something that he don't like? And now you want to disown him from your entire organization. That's a slave mentality. You're doing it for me, it's all good. But now you're doing it against me, or not necessarily against me, but you're speaking out against my organization. It's not good anymore. That's a slave mentality, slave master mentality.
All right, there's that. Draymond not mincing words. Stephen A., what's your reaction to Green using the slavery comparison?
I thought it was excessive. I thought it was uncalled for, and I thought it was unnecessary. And you're listening to a huge, huge fan of Draymond Green. He could be on my team any day of the week. He's a great person. He's a great warrior. And I'm not talking about the Golden State Warriors. I'm talking about he's a fighter on the basketball court. He played for my favorite coach in all of college basketball, which is Tom Izzo. But I thought he was a bit excessive here. If he had pointed to Charles Oakley being physically removed from the arena as cause for him to get to that point, I could understand that. But he was simply talking about Charles Oakley saying things that were deemed as insulting to the Knicks organization, and James Dolan responding by wanting him removed from the arena. The fact of the matter is that you've got to know the history of Charles Oakley and the history of James Dolan. James Dolan is inept. He is not a great owner at all. He's great at making money, but winning is not his forte. If you want to win, you don't want James Dolan as the owner of your basketball team. The facts prove as much. But the facts also prove that he employs an abundance of African Americans within Madison Square Garden. He always has. The facts prove that Charles Oakley, a good dude, somebody that I've known for 20 years, has never been shy about saying whatever it is that he feels about the Knicks organization, because he's appalled that they've struggled so much and so miserably. Not to mention the fact that James Dolan didn't really take over until 1999. Charles Oakley was there from 88 to 98. Dolan was a part of the mix, but it was James Dolan's father who had presided over Madison Square Garden along with others. And it was during the Dave Checketts era, which included Pat Riley, and then after that, Jeff Van Gundy. Ernie Grunfeld, now the president of basketball operations in Washington, was there and presiding over the New York Knicks as a GM at the time. So the organization was vastly different at that time that Oakley was there than it has been under the James Dolan regime. So you got to remember that James Dolan literally met and sat down with Charles Oakley for the first time ever just the other day in the commissioner's office. You take all of those things into consideration, and you're Charles Oakley on the record really wanting to be a part of the Knicks family. If you're James Dolan and he says he wants these things, but you believe that he is insulting you, a lot of people in James Dolan's position are not going to act favorably for him. The reason why I think, Max, ultimately that Draymond Green's comments were a bit excessive is because outside of security guards forcibly removing Charles Oakley, because we all know that unnecessary on the part of James Dolan and the New York Knicks, in terms of not wanting to receive a shrapnel of criticism and not being receptive to you for throwing it in his direction. I don't care whether you're white, you're black, you're Jewish, you're Catholic, you're Latino, you're Native American, you're Asian, or whomever. When you are in an authoritative position and somebody comes at you that way, you usually don't respond favorably. That's a matter of somebody not liking you. Of racism, and that's where or slavery or slave mentality per se, and that's where I took issue with what Draymond said in this particular situation. It's applicable at times in the world of sports more than people realize, but in this particular instance, I don't believe that to be the case.
Draymond Green was wrong. He should not have compared it to slavery. Slavery, the history of slavery in this country involved the destruction of generation after generation of human beings. And that's not what this is. This is kind of business practice in the United States of America that he's objecting to. But let me say, when he brings it up, as objectionable as it may be to many, we can't pretend we don't understand what he's talking about. It is hard to ignore that the NBA is a largely African-American league in terms of labor, in terms of the players. And the owners are almost exclusively white. And that is connected to the legacy of slavery. So that when we see an owner treating a former player in a way that even appears, rightly or wrongly, but the optics are that it's dehumanizing, the way he's treating that player, that connection in people's minds and the optics of the league will bring what Draymond Green is talking about into mind. I mean, it will bring it into focus. So I get what he means, but I think it was clumsily stated, because anytime you compare anything to the institution of slavery and the reverberations since, you're kind of discrediting or not really properly respecting the suffering of and the human catastrophe that was the institution of slavery in the United States. And by the way, I know what it sounds like for a white guy on TV to be saying that about an African-American player who does have a point to make. Nevertheless, I think he was wrong to compare it to slavery, at least, or a slave owner's mentality. At least it was clumsily stated. It needed to be articulated better, I think, Stephen A.
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you, Max, and I appreciate you saying what you said, because you're absolutely on the money. And I'll piggyback off of that by simply, saying something that I want you to comment on here. One of the things that that I pay real attention to, particularly as an African American, is that making sure things count. In other words, when you use incendiary language or polarizing a language, and you know that it's going to be talked about and debated about and what have you, you have a responsibility, particularly when you bring up one of the isms, to make sure that it counts, to make sure that it's applicable accurately so, and it's something that's relatively undeniable so it can provoke a larger discussion. When you do something like Draymond just did, you minimize the discussion. You don't elevate it. Because if you're a white individual out there like Ryan Russillo, who was on Mike and Mike this morning talking about it, I'm sure he might take some heat for what he said, because he was just saying, when has it ever been a problem just not to like somebody? The fact of the matter is, everything that he was saying, elaborating on the Draymond Green scenario here, Ryan Russillo was absolutely right in what he was saying, and I defend him to the nth degree. There are times when somebody doesn't like you. That doesn't make it racism. I know of athletes who were late tens of times to practice, and and then people talked about, well, they're being treated a certain way because somebody doesn't like them and it's racism. No, they don't like you. Or you have individuals that didn't have the greatest reputation inside of locker rooms, and then all of a sudden we're talking about race again. No, they didn't like your behind. It has nothing to do with you being black. It has everything to do with how you're conducting yourself. Those are the kind of things I think that we have to pay attention to, Max, because if we don't, what happens is, when we really have a bona fide, salient, poignant argument, it gets diminished because people are exhausted from the topic of bringing up race, and they actually have an excuse to be exhausted by it because it was brought up on too many occasions when it had no business being brought up.
But in this case, two things. I'll deal with what you just said in a second. In this case, what are the optics? The optics are, it was an African American, and the owner is white. And so, sure, Ryan Russillo and whoever else brings up the point, it's not a crime to not like someone, but power dynamics are important. There is a reason that ownership is almost exclusively white, and that is the legacy of slavery in this country. There's no getting around that. The fact that it's almost exclusively white, and that labor is largely African American. So the optics, even in instances, and I'm not saying this is one of them, where the owner might be right and the player or former player might be wrong. It doesn't seem to be the case here, but let's say it was. The optics are important, and it will resonate with people in a certain way that reminds them of the history of inequity in this country. That's one. Two, you bring up the isms, right? Don't dilute legitimate claims of racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, etc., which are alive and well in this country. Don't dilute those claims with claims that are themselves diluted, that may have a point in there somewhere, but don't really apply with full force, aren't really literal. And I agree with that. I agree with that as any person from a persecuted minority in this country, or even just people who are socially conscious who aren't from persecuted minority in terms of the culture of their background. I think we should recognize that. I think that's a valid point. If you run around claiming racism where it's not clear, where it's unclear that it's directly racism, or sometimes where it doesn't exist, it does dilute claims and undermine claims, legitimate claims of racism, which, as I mentioned, are alive and well. In this case, I understand what Draymond was getting at. It was clumsily stated and therefore could be put in the, hey, you're diluting the real discussion category.
Well, the other thing that I think is important to mention, Max, before we finish this segment is that, you also have to take into account that even though it was clumsily stated and what have you, you have to have justification for it, and you have to take into account the ramifications. For example, you allude to ownership. Sure, the NBA has mostly white owners. The first African-American majority owner in major professional sports in this country happened to be Bob Johnson. Who's that for? The Charlotte Bobcats, now the Charlotte Hornets, who, by the way, is in the National Basketball Association. The majority owner of the Charlotte Hornets right now is who, Max Kellerman? It would happen to be
Michael Jordan.
When you look at, all right, do you see an African-American owner in Major League Baseball? Do you see an African-American owner in the National Football League? Do you see an African-American owner in hockey? The list goes on and on. So when we look at it, we understand that, as Richard Lapchick historically points out, that the NBA has an edge on other major sports entities in this nation as it pertains to African Americans. And so I'm just saying the point is that doesn't absolve something like this from happening. In other words, if indeed you have an owner with a slave mentality or whatever, it doesn't mean that this sport is immune to those circumstances. But it does mean you have to take into account that when we discuss as it pertains to major professional sports in this country, there is no doubt that the NBA, with the athletes and the way they're being paid, with the guaranteed contracts, with African Americans holding head coaching positions and executive positions as GMs or what have you, with an African American being an owner, the NBA is ahead of the curve. And if you're Draymond Green and you're en route to New Orleans for NBA All-Star Weekend and you bring this up on the eve of that, how are you looking out for the brand that has clearly helped facilitate you being where you are today? These are the kind of things you have to take into consideration.
I think it's instructive, though, that it's celebrated that there's one African-American owner in the NBA, which was largely perceived for most of its history as the African-American sport among the major sports. And the reason for that is wealth is concentrated with white people. And those social networks then reinforce who owns what, especially in major leagues. And so, therefore, again, I appreciate the gist of what Draymond is saying. The optics are important. The power dynamics are important. But in this case, though that resonates with it, and it's connected to the history of this country, in this case, what I believe actually happened was a powerful business owner treated a former laborer shabbily. And yes, there's the optics of race involved, but it's really a criticism in this moment, I think, of business more than the legacy of slavery.
Well said, Max. Let's take this conversation in a different direction, because that's not all Draymond was in the news for. So he was ejected late in the first half of Wednesday's 109-86 win over the Kings after drawing a pair of technical fouls for arguing. Green was